My name is Sarah King. I'm going to talk about our family's experience of research. My son has glycogen storage disease type 1b. For those of you who aren't GSD experts, there are two main symptoms, the first being low blood sugar and the second being neutropenia. And it's the neutropenia I'm going to talk about today. Here's my son shortly after birth. Hyperglycemia was detected shortly after birth. He was very sleepy and he didn't feed. When they gave him glucose and his lactate levels shot up. We very quickly had a presumed diagnosis of GSD type 1. At that stage, his neutrophils were at the low end of the normal range, but by the time we had a genetically confirmed diagnosis of 1B, when he was about 6 weeks of age, by then his neutrophil count had dropped to 0.2. The neutropenia quite quickly made itself felt. He had a very bad Pseudomonas infection at the age of 4 months, which required 3 weeks stay in hospital. He was started on GCSF 3 times a week at that point, but his neutrophil count never increased beyond 0.2 really. It was usually around 0.1. He had frequent infections, bacterial infections. Usually they would clear up with antibiotics, but there were a number of hospital admissions and the antibiotics used to cause terrible diarrhea that was very difficult to deal with at home. He also had a real issue with viruses. He was always snotty, always a runny nose, and some of the viruses seemed to cause some kind of metabolic disturbance, and we would have to rush him to hospital in the early hours of the morning with vomiting and lactic acidosis. When he was 1 year old, we probably had the worst occurrence when he had his 1 year booster vaccinations and he ended up in intensive care with sepsis. So to give you an idea, he was born in 2017, but the year 2018 I went through our diary and we had 6 unscheduled hospital admissions that year just for issues arising from the neutropenia. So the planned admissions to do with blood sugars and feeding regime, they were on top of that, and they ranged in duration from a few days up to a few weeks. So I would say that James was on 1.5 hourly feeds and that was stressful, but the feeding was one thing, the neutropenia was really something else in terms of the stress, the worry and the disruption to our daily lives. It was becoming very difficult to have any kind of normal life. And the impact on James, he felt like a fundamentally unwell child. He was always ill and it gave him a really miserable life. So for those of you who don't know, I believe up until recently, the reason why 1Bs have neutropenia was unclear. And then I believe it was late 2018, some research was presented at a conference, and my husband and I first became aware of it when this paper was published in early 2019. The paper not only explained the mechanism for the neutropenia in GSD1B, but also proposed an existing drug that could be used as a potential treatment. So we were very keen to discuss this with James's medical team. For us, our main concern was his poor level of general health. He wasn't well, he constantly felt ill. It was very difficult for us to cope with, and we were concerned, really, there was this worry at the back of our minds that at some point he was going to get an infection that the antibiotics couldn't deal with. For his doctor, Dr. Helen Mundy, I think one of the chief concerns was the feeding tube. So James had an NG tube and he had to have a bridle to hold it in place because his cheeks really didn't cope with the tapes that had to keep the tube in place, and he used to remove it, particularly overnight, which was very dangerous on a continuous feed. So he might have noticed in the pictures he had a bridle fitted, which solved the problem of him pulling the tube out, but his septum was starting to wear out. So the big hope was that if we tried the EMPA, we would improve his general health and maybe he could be able to have a gastrostomy. So we started the EMPA in 2019 and during a hospital admission. His neutrophil count at the start of the admission was 0.2 and a neutrophil function test showed that his neutrophils clearly behaved abnormally. It took a few days to start the EMPA and increase to a twice daily dose, but after 3 days we did another full blood count and his neutrophil count had increased to 1.5. I should point out that he was still on GCSF at that point and he also had a cold, as always. We took him home and within a week we saw clear improvements, an increase in energy levels, and he was just a completely different child. We had to increase his carbohydrate intake because he had so much more energy. He was burning through his sugars more quickly. The diarrhea stopped within about a week. That was a permanent feature of our lives, and it changed to constipation. And he was just much happier, hugely happier, and much more confident. We continued the GCSF and the EMPA in tandem after a while, but the GCSF was phased out after about 4 to 6 weeks, and that I think it had a slight effect on dropping the neutrophil count down, but it didn't have any effect on how well James was. We've been on the EMPA now for just over 2 years. James is really well. His neutrophil count has settled in the 0.5 to 0.7 range. Neutrophil function has normalised. Our lives are transformed. There are probably 3 main areas. Firstly, James has been able to have a gastrostomy. That was inserted in November 2020. He had a minor infection at the site about a week after the surgery, but that just cleared up with antibiotics, and we've had no problems since, apart from some granulation, which we can manage. Because the tube is bigger, we've been able to start a blended diet, and that's improved his health and general well-being even more. And he's a lot happier with the gastrostomy. It's improved his confidence a lot. It's really transformed his life. Infections wise, we had the minor infection at the gastrostomy site, and other than that, we've just had a couple of UTIs as a side effect of the EMPA. James on a prophylactic antibiotic now, and that seems to deal with those. Antibiotics no longer cause diarrhea, which is really nice for us. Unscheduled hospital admissions. So we went 18 months with 0 unscheduled hospital admissions. So you can't imagine how much that's improved our lives. He did have a couple of admissions recently when he picked up a vomiting bug from school, so he blotted his copybook there, but we can forgive him for that. Feeding wise, we think his dietary absorption has improved because his iron levels used to be very low, and they've improved to normal now. We've also managed to stretch his feeds. So up until the age of 3, he was on 1.5 hourly feeds, and he's now on 2.5 hours, which has been a huge improvement for all of us. I think there are probably 2 things at play there. One is hopefully the dietary absorption has improved, but the second, I think, is the blended feeds, which again are down to the EMPA, because we can only do that with the gastrostomy. So in conclusion, we've had a very positive experience with research, and we're very grateful to the scientists who carried out that breakthrough research, and to James's doctor and the rest of his medical team who really engaged with us and were willing to try something new. Thank you.